proposition. To head to the floor, please.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yeah.
In a world dominated by the superpowers of the West, policies echo a detachment from the realities of the global South. Listen closely to the examples of Bolivia, Cameroon, and Uganda, a series of unintended consequences that was conducted by the West. It is evident that the World Bank policies in the status quo does not work. We would rather have a world full of high-quality policies, even if it comes at an expense of quantity. Two arguments all forward. First, when we get more tailored policies that better cater to developing nations. Second, when we get more regional cooperation. Before that, here's the framework. Firstly, what does the World Bank look like in the status quo? Currently, the number of votes are proportional towards the financial contributions you have made within the World Bank. Countries like the US have 15% of the entirety of the votes, whereas countries like Seychelles only have 0.04% of them. Secondly, the comparative on our side is that every country, no matter how much money you contribute to, will have one single vote within the voting process. But thirdly, donations towards the World Bank are unlikely to decrease on our side of the house for two reasons. One, it is incredibly unrealistic that the US will pull out because the World Bank was literally created by themselves. When they leave, that significantly undermines their trust in the international sphere to a significant degree. But two, the West will still want to maintain the soft power toward the developing nations insofar as that get them power and influence both on a political level and economical level. All of those proves as to why the donation is unlikely to decrease on our side of the house. First argument, tailored policies. The thesis of this argument is that one country, one vote system enables the World Bank to create nuanced policies that actually help people on the ground. The first question under this is what is the problem on their side of the house? The first is the World Bank imposes policies that align with the Western agenda but doesn't align with the interests of the locals. The Western governments care more about catering to their domestic electorates, so they take policies that benefit their own country rather than those that are actually beneficial for people on the ground. A good example of this is market liberalization, where the West lowers tariffs so that because it literally aligns with their interests on ideology of things like liberalization. But notice here that this is extremely harmful for the people on the ground insofar as an infant industry of the small economy within the developing nations are unable to compete with the mature industries of the West. But secondly, a lot of policies right now are blanket policies that are applied universally over the multiple projects as opposed to the ones that are individualized. This is because, first, it is just likely that the perception, they simply want the perception that they're doing something and they're strong. But secondly, I think that as contributions are measured numerically, Western officials have a personal career incentive to quickly forward and complete as many projects as possible in the status quo. But thirdly, I don't think that the West has simply contextualized knowledge to begin with. The mechanism for that is because they're geographically and culturally distant. What they do is that they create speculation by looking at things like data, by looking at inflation rate, by looking at things like GDP. A lot of the Western workers at the World Bank who graduated from prestigious universities like Harvard is simply unable to have epistemic access to what's actually happening on the ground. Nuance falls on opposition policies, especially when the policies are being streamlined. Finally, I want to do a bit of preemption here. Opposition might contest that they will have an active incentive to make the policies better for people on the ground by actually working with locals, for instance. The first one I posit is, we do agree that in the vast majority of the cases, policies enacted are not going to directly kill someone or directly harm and kill people on the ground. The nuance of our case is that there tends to be subtle harms that the West cannot foresee that accumulate over time as a result of these kind of unconscious policies. It is extremely hard for the World Bank to be held accountable for these people because one, it is difficult to comprehensively track the effects back when years have passed, but two, many countries do not want to call out these harms when they risk losing support from those kind of Western nations that they have a lot of the votes to begin with. But secondly, this is simply inherently true, right? It has always been the case that Western countries have been criticized that those policies have been detached from the global realities, right? This is why in Mozambique, for instance, high-quality airports and subways were created, but this is still underutilized after 20 years simply because it was created in the area that the local peoples are not using. Before I move on, sure.
Why should the 155th GDP country in the world, Liechtenstein, have the same power in your bank as Brazil or India?
I don't really get the answer. I don't really get that question to the POI. I've already talked to you about the incentive of countries wanting to have an influence over that region. But furthermore, I don't think that this is going to donation is not an important point insofar as I've already proven that the pull and the money point isn't likely to change on either side of the house. What is the comparative here? The first one I point out is that the policies will be more nuanced on our side of the house for two reasons. One, less developed countries, unlike the Western nations, are the ones that are more likely to seek and receive more loans in the future. Therefore, they have a parallel incentive to cooperate in terms of making good policies, because that way you can also get cooperation that you need in the future. But secondly, two, developing nations share a common collective incentives. Even if they are geographically distant, it is likely that they face things like collective, struggles that you as someone who has a same economical background face. But secondly, there will be more opting from developing nations because they can have their voice reflected in an institution. There are three implications of this. One, the creation of the policies will be carried out through a cooperation between the developing nations and the West on our side of the house. But two, you now create an incentive for the policymakers to do research and cooperate with the locals when they know that the project may get voted out. But three, you are far less likely to see stringent austerity measures being imposed when developing nations are collectively against this. The impact of this argument is simple. You get more tailored policies on our side of the house for developing nations. This looks like projects that foster economic growth. This looks like policies that strengthen the basic infrastructures of the indigenous communities. Second argument, when we get increased cooperation. The premise is that in many instances, countries that are regionally proximate are not cooperative with each other. This is because they're oftentimes in a state of things like direct competition due to a lack of resources, trade rivalries, political tensions. They're inclined to have competition rather than cooperation. Given that, there are two distinct reasons why developing nations become far more cooperative on our side of the house. The first is we reverse the incentive of the nations. On opposition's paradigm, the policies are carried out single-handedly by the West. However, given that every country will have the same voice on side of opposition, the incentive of small countries shifts from simply appealing to one single Western nations to appealing to the entirety of the global developing nations. Therefore, the implication of this is that developing nations are much more likely to implement policies in a way that are beneficial for the surrounding countries because that increases their chances of their policies being elected in the future. This looks like roads that goes beyond the national borders. This looks like water services that also provide water to other nations. But secondly, developing countries not seeking loans also becomes cooperative in implementing policy for other nations insofar as it also increases their chances of receiving future loans or aid when they need it. That is why they're more likely to be cooperative on net on-side competition. What is the impact of this? We think there are two crucial impacts that is debate winning. Firstly, more people will reap the benefits of the World Bank policies. This is because with the rise in regional cooperation, simply put, the number of people who can benefit from these kind of policies is going to rise on side competition. Therefore, regardless of what Team Canada might say on the quantity of the policies, it is likely that even if the number of it falls, I think a lot of people will get benefit from those kind of one single policy. But secondly, this lessens conflict between neighboring countries. Insofar as there's more joint economic and infrastructure projects, and this creates interdependence between countries, any instability endangering these kind of projects harms all nations involved. Therefore, this fosters a shared interest in avoiding such situations, leading to reduced conflict and reduced tensions on our side of the house. For all those reasons, vote for side competition.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes. Judges, will we proceed with the next speaker? May we now have the first speaker from opposition to begin with, please.
If I speak at this volume, can everyone hear me? Okay, wonderful. Opposition is correct in identifying that the World Bank reflects some kind of disparity. But what they miss is the reality, which is that countries are highly disparate. That Indonesia's GDP and citizen population is simply incomparable to Norway, that it is policymakers in New York and Shanghai that are the ones that set the terms of the global economy. So the question within this debate from opposition is whether or not the World Bank should follow the current reality of global economics or allow itself to completely crumble by refusing to acknowledge where the power and money to save and uplift lives is truly held. On opposition, we believe that in the scales of global finance, equal weight doesn't always balance. There's three things that I want to do in this speech. Firstly, stance and framing from opposition that I should take out the broad majority of the material on representation and representative policy, some other extraneous responses to the Prime Minister, and then two constructive arguments in this speech. The first on the principle of fairness, the second on the hollowing out and destruction of the World Bank. On framing, there's three things. One, on opposition, we support the current World Bank weighted voting system that is based on capital share and economic size. We are aware that this has flaws. We are looking for the best system, for the perfect system. Secondly, in order to best achieve the needs of developing countries, we support two current reforms. Firstly, increased voting power for large and growing economies that has been happening in the global south. So for example, China, India, or Indonesia. But secondly, evolution plans such as the one that is supported currently by Janet Yellen in America that reorients the World Bank towards climate funding, for example, or providing more financial support for developing countries. Recently, this has resulted in a tenfold increase in portfolio inflows in Egypt and $203 million in investment for Haiti's garment sector. But lastly, if the West and the US in particular, as proposition says, has strong incentives to maintain their hegemony and what they want the global order to actually look like, they will do so independent of this policy, through their trade, through their currency, through their power. So the question that proposition must then answer is whether or not it is done through multilateral institutions with at least some cooperation and input from developing countries, or to let them set the terms of the global economy in a fractured and isolationist manner. A couple of responses to the PM. They say that donations are unlikely to decrease because it will significantly undermine American trust. But I don't think they give any actual reasoning behind this. Clearly, taking out callable capital if you have hundreds of billions of dollars with the World Bank is probably more likely because you don't want the significant financial risk, especially given that America is not in a great financial situation in the first place. If they care about their domestic political situation, that is an easy thing for opponents to call them out on. No, thank you. I don't think your analysis reflects the status quo. The second thing that they tell us is that policy making will not be nuanced. I just disagree with this upright. I think that national policy making is the status quo, where we give large lump sums of money to developing countries and then people on the ground decide where it is given. That is the reason why 1.2 million Bangladeshis in the past year got access to improved clean water, to improved hygiene, to improved sanitation, because it was people on the ground that ended up dispersing the funding. Obviously that is going to happen because they know far more. And the reason why you get projects for the most important things is because they are relatively non-controversial. Aid for emergencies, aid for the eradication of poverty is the most likely to exist on either side of the house because they're immediate projects that requires less bureaucracy, that are much less unpopular than more risky financing projects. So those are the ones that we ought to care about. The second argument, I think, frankly, doesn't make sense to me. The Global South doesn't immediately become a collective allyship just because they now band together across the West. Nigeria and Tanzania still don't have the same interest just because they're part of the same regional bloc. First argument then, and the premise of this argument is a distribution of votes weighted based on economic contribution and size will always be fairer than allocating one vote per nation. This is a normative violation for two reasons. The first, because one country, one vote doesn't consider the size and economic size of a country. It is simply absurd that the 500 million people of Europe will get 50 votes simply because of their geographic distribution into 50 independent countries, whereas 1 billion Chinese people will only get one. But secondly, member countries voluntarily give money to the bank, and those resources are deployed at low interest rates to other countries. So it is top contributors, like the United Kingdom, like the USA, that should have more autonomy over the directives of the contributed money through a fiduciary obligation. They're the ones that are contributing. They are the ones whose financial risk ends up falling on when there are risky financing projects. Just because an actor is impacted by a policy doesn't mean that they should get more control. Democratic rights are owed to a person that has something taken away from them. A Mexican citizen says they may be greatly impacted by American policy, but they're not the ones that vote in American elections. It is American taxpayers that are the ones giving to the government. It is not poor countries that deserve comparatively more say, but the actual grip that the World Bank takes from, that has large economies, that gives to the World Bank and deserve something in autonomy in return. The current voting model better approximates the right to fairness and the representative nature of the institution. Regardless of practical, we're already ahead. I'll take a POI for Paul. Second argument then, the premise of this argument, the cohesive function of the World Bank is crippled when there is no credibility, no buy-in. This especially hurts the developing countries the proposition wanted to help. There are two things that are going to happen. Large economy countries like Germany, like the UK, like America will pull their money back and claw back contributions. This is for two reasons. The first is because of financial risk. No sovereign nation will allow an institution over which it has basically no thank you, influence or control to use its billions of dollars freely, especially because many countries are dealing with large budget deficits after the pandemic. An inability to have veto power, or at least a significant amount of power over large-scale, risky financing or debt plans that will lose them billions of dollars, they cause for huge insecurity for countries who will not allow their capital to remain within those institutions. Secondly, in terms of nationalist response, thank you, and this deals with their domestic political opposition. Countries are likely to face domestic political pressure to punish the World Bank. Republicans in the American Congress will place pressure on the Biden administration to withdraw funding as a show of strength. In Germany, Scholz already faces large amounts of pressure over this foreign policy spending and is unlikely to be continuing the contributions to the World Bank at the same level. The comparative is very, very simple. The current model allows for competition in shareholding that increases the total amount of funding available because there's no incentive to give more in terms of contribution when your vote is capped equally. Go ahead.
Okay, if you principally oppose against the one country, one vote system, would you also oppose against other institutions that adopt one country, one vote system?
We think one country, one vote system institutions have broadly just been feckless. Like, for example, the General Assembly in the UN says very nice things and does nothing. It is the Security Council in the UN that actually gives voting power to large countries. That means it actually has say because it has buy-in from those large countries. Second part of this argument, the World Bank loses its high credit and trust among major commercial financial institutions and capital markets. It's not just this is really important because it enables it to borrow money at low rates and give loans to developing countries with very low interest. This is not only because its reserves are smaller and so funding from countries will decrease, but also that there's a great amount of financial uncertainty that institutions like Goldman Sachs will feel really insecure about. This is a new process after 75 years of history in the World Bank that definitely raises doubt among creditors. Borrowing costs and all associated loan costs will increase. This is bad. In the 2022 fiscal year, the World Bank deployed $115 billion in response to genuine global crises that helped countries address rising food insecurity and manage refugee flows. After Turkey's earthquakes, expand access to housing and to infrastructure. These are life-saving loans and resources that the World Bank provides. The proposition cannot lie to you and say our families, these are real people that we help and deserve the money that is within the World Bank as it stands. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Spoke for 8 minutes and 18 seconds. Judges, maybe we proceed with the next speaker. May we now have the second speaker from the opposition to continue with their case?
Okay, can everyone hear me? My speech will start in 3, 2, 1.
In Bolivia, the World Bank gave out loans under the condition that they will privatize their water supply. What followed was chaos. Companies monopolized the water supply, and overnight, the price of water increased drastically. What this meant was that poor people no longer could get water and were disproportionately harmed by such policies. I'm going to talk about 3 things in my speech. Firstly, is the principle in this debate really relevant? Secondly, which side is better for the quality of policies? And thirdly, on my extension, on why this increases or disincentivizes regional conflict. So firstly, is the principle in this debate actually relevant? So the first thing that they say in their speech is that representation should be prioritized. I have 2 major responses to this. Firstly, I don't think this is actually important in this debate for 2 major reasons. Number 1, this is not important because the World Bank goal is helping developing nations. That means that the major deadlock in this debate is probably going to be something on which side actually helps developing nations more. Clearly something that we win on our side of the house. But secondly, we can violate principles when there's direct practical benefits or direct practical harms at the expense of those principles. For example, that is why we have things like seatbelt laws. That is why I'm not allowed to drink and drive in every single country, right? So if we can directly prove that there is a practical benefit to actually violating the principles of representation, then we win this debate. But the second response I want to give is that I think representation should be about representing people who get the most impact from this organization. No thank you. For example, we don't have American citizens getting represented in the Japanese parliament simply because no American citizen would actively be harmed by the Japanese parliament in the status quo. And I just want you to note that they never gave any mechanism as to prove why this should be way below fiduciary obligations. Ultimately, if their weighing metric is true, then because people in developing nations are probably going to be harmed more on our side of the house, obviously this principle applies to our side of the house even more because these developing nations are going to be harmed a lot more in the future. No, thank you. So moving on to my second clash on which side is better for the quality of policy. So the first thing that we said under this clash is that it's better for the quality of policy because you get more discussion, because you get more tailored policy on our side of the house. The major response that we got here from side proposition is that donations will decrease because obviously America, China, etc. All these donations would probably decrease because there's no incentive to actually donate anymore. Number 1, I just want to note that there's no compared to their GDPs, $1 billion in terms of donations isn't a lot compared to the $1 trillion, over $1 trillion GDP that the United States has. So obviously, their analysis on damages being very, very significant is wrong. But secondly, I just want to prove why this is very, very unlikely to happen. Because the premise of their argument on donations will decrease is that the incentives for donations will decrease. No, thank you. This is wrong because the incentive of donator nations is unlikely to be utilitarian, like having profit incentives. Because at the point in which they donate, they're losing money, right? So if they do have utilitarian incentives, they probably won't donate to begin with. The most likely incentive then for donation is perception, i.e. they want to look good in the international sphere. This is why this is so detrimental for side opposition. Because if the incentive is perception, then countries will opt out for 2 major reasons. Number 1, opting out will bring about massive media attention and scrutiny from other countries for being ultimately selfish. We think that this is a very big argument. But secondly, America and Western nations are unlikely to opt out because they lose credibility and face on the international sphere because they literally created the World Bank and they abandoned it. That means that they lose trust and credibility and they risk bad perception. Notice that I think this is empirically true because when the IMF implemented quotas on decreasing the power of the United States within the IMF, the US didn't pull out or decrease the amount of donations they gave to the IMF because of this specific reason. Before I move on, yes.
So you're right, it is about perception. But in the World Trade Organization, when America faced significant pushback, it was domestic perception that made it that America literally left. Why does that not happen on your side?
Because on our side, you get significant international backlash. I think that significant international backlash is outweighed by the amount of money you lose from parliament within your country, especially considering my first response was that you only lose $1 billion compared to the GDP of America that is very, very low. So moving on. The second thing that they talk about is that people on the ground will pick out policies. I think this is just empirically untrue. Because in the status quo, because in our prime minister, we give you multiple examples and analysis as to why this is untrue. For example, in Bolivia, the World Bank literally picked all the policy. That is why it was so detrimental for people on the ground in Bolivia. So obviously, I don't think people on the ground will pick out these policies. But the second thing I just want to note is that even if people on the ground will pick out policies, we still think that our side gets better policy on our side of the house because you have because people are more invested in these policies. You have more tailored policies because of the fact that you have more discussion within the World Bank in general. But so moving on to my third point on why this that is why our point on the quality of policy is actually is very debate winning in this match. So moving on, why this de-incentivizes reasonable conflict? The third thing in my speech. So the premise of this argument is that conflicts polarizes countries against you. This is for two major reasons. The first reason is that regional conflicts inherently polarize nations against one another. Under a battleground where thousands of your citizens get murdered by other nations, the only thing that's left for each side is hatred. But second, in the web of alliances that are constructed through conflicts, nations impose sanctions and at the extreme join conflicts, further polarizing countries against them. What is the comparative here? We think that this is extremely harmful for developing nations on our side, because when you get divided, you can no longer get the aid insofar as you acquire them through majority votes. By joining in conflicts, you literally create enemies that are willing to oppose you when you want to get aid. What is the comparative in this match? Notice that this wouldn't happen on side opposition because countries that actively start conflicts are unlikely to get aid on opposition. This is because countries that start conflicts are countries that don't care about their social perception and do so out of selfish incentives. For example, Russia probably wouldn't get, donations from the United States because of the fact that they started conflict, because of the fact that they are massively polarized against each other. And these are the countries that the West hates, which probably means that they won't get the donations on their side of the house. Before I'm going, yes.
Why is allowing 50 small European countries to have 50 votes over large population developing countries like Brazil the best way to stop these invasive or hegemonic incentives?
So because if you increase polarization against your nation, then obviously you decrease the amount of the chance of you getting loans on our side of the house. That is why you increase the incentive for you to not polarize these nations against each other. That means that on that, the probability of you going into conflict with another nation actively decreases. So the impact of this, we think, is that you simply stop a lot of conflicts on our side of the house, which we think is inherently good for two major reasons. Number one, we save more people on the ground because we think that conflict actively harms people on the ground, not just soldiers, but also citizens, because you bomb people on the ground, because you bomb infrastructure. But the second thing I want to point out is that we increase development because conflict needlessly destroys things like infrastructure, and it's hard to bounce back after conflict because of things like that, lack of manpower, and etc. This is just debate winning, because even if we can only stop one conflict, that's still tens of thousands of innocent lives, orphans, starving children that we save on our side of the house. For all these reasons, we're so proud to propose.
Speakers speak for 8 minutes and 15 seconds. May we proceed with the next speaker? May we now have the second speaker from proposition to continue with the please?
I'm going to do what side proposition asked us to do in the POI, which is observe what happens in all other institutions that use one country, one vote systems. In the World Trade Organization, a one country, one vote system meant that any vote that was directly oppositional to the US led to the US actively leaving. In the United Nations General Assembly, all votes are one country, one vote, but are also non-enforceable and are largely symbolic. But it is instead institutions like the UNSC that actively offer veto power that also have binding agreements. It's institutions like the IMF that actively allow for vote sharing on our side of the house that also allow for sufficient policy. So by the end of this, it should be very clear that what we're debating was not whether or not in principle one country, one vote is good or bad, but rather not this instance of one country, one vote is good or bad. And our principle very clearly prove that. I'm going to do 3 things in my speech. First, I'm going to discuss the principle, which they had vocal engagement to. Then I'm going to talk about whether or not you get more money, and I think this is more important than their clash. I'll talk about why. Then I'll talk about whether or not you get better or worse policy, and then a final argument on the privatization of loaning. Firstly, on the principle, our principal claim here was very simple, that in very similar ways to governance systems that take away from certain people, that we ought to give people proportionately more than what they take away. They have 2 responses. The first thing they say is, when there's a significant practical benefit, we should be able to override a principle. This is ridiculous, right? The logical extremity of this claim is that, everyone should donate all of their disposable income to the agency over the money and capital that they require. And the capacity to then distribute that capital is also something that we consider. And insofar as that is true, we should also value the fact that these countries are giving a lot of money, and that should in and of itself justify our principle. The second thing they say is they read out the World Bank mandate. They say the World Bank cares about helping developing countries. I think this is a reason for why we should care about the practical, but I still think this is insufficient to deal with our principle, which is that if I'm able to prove to you that we're still able to help out developing countries on our side, then our principle is an independent reason for why you vote for opposition, i.e. it is a more just and more fair way to distribute these votes, and there was no engagement from them on that. On the practical, the first thing I want to discuss on the practical is whether or not the decrease in money is sufficient. Because the silver bullet line from side proposition in this debate is, it's okay for us to have marginally less money because, we can have better policy. The first thing I'll point out is their statistics are kind of wrong. It's not $1 billion by the USA, it's $50 billion in callable capital, and $3.5 billion being donated annually each year. It's 93.4% of a $178 billion equity being donated to private capital lenders, which they didn't want to respond to. So when we're talking about the type of money that is leaving, it is literally half of the money that the World Bank has, and 90% of the money that the World Bank will get, which obviously mirrors the capacity for the World Bank to have. They have a couple of direct responses though. The first thing they say is, well, compared to the actual GDP of the USA, it won't be that significant of a cost. But that ignores a couple of the more empirical things that we point out. One, that on our side of the house, the US's situation when it comes to its spending is relatively precarious, and it has a higher threshold to justify its spending, and other large actors like the USA, right, like Western countries that actively lose power in this world. The second thing they say is, well, you face international backlash, and for some reason this international backlash is important. But we can see to some extent you face international backlash. What they had to prove was that this outweighs the domestic backlash, and here's why it doesn't. One, because the domestic beholdencies of the USA are inherently more important. It's what secures votes for politicians, it's what makes sure that you don't get opposition criticism. And even if some Guatemalan dictator doesn't want to align with you, at the end of the day, because all the policymakers are still in New York, and at the end of the day, because the US is still the largest hegemonic power, international backlash is largely feckless on their side of the house. But 2, and I actually want to flip this argument against them, the USA can turn to other factors and means of influence that we think are actively worse. I'll elaborate on the third argument why they're worse when it comes to loan, but I think just look at empirically what the USA does when it doesn't have to use things like the World Bank. It uses things like sanctions, it uses things like threats, it uses things like its own unilateral deals, and then sends the entire Navy when you don't, agree with those deals. And all of those are the types of things that the USA would now pursue on their side of the house because it is forced to retaliate. It looks weaker for the USA and other large actors when they lose a significant portion of power that they have in the World Bank right now and are forced to turn to them on their side of the house. So this clearly proves that countries withdraw money. The second part of this, and they really had no response to this at all in their 8 minutes of rebuttal, which is that private capital lenders no longer want to invest. And at best, this means interest rates go up because risk goes up, and all of the analysis that Maria gives you that they still have not responded to must be responded to in third prop. At worst, it means banks like Goldman Sachs, who frankly don't care about international backlash, just don't give money to the World Bank, and therefore they have less money to deal with. Here's why this clash is a prerequisite to all of their analysis about cooperation. One, because if you care about cooperation, there has to be money for you to care about in the first place, right? Developing countries aren't going to hold hands and sing kumbaya if the money that they're talking about is very, very little, right? But 2, the capacity for developing countries to pay back things like interest rates is often a prerequisite for you getting good or bad loans. And we can play example tennis all we want in this debate. They can talk about Bolivia, we can talk about the $500 million that actually did help out Turkey after the earthquake. The point is that the bottom line of these countries increases on their side when interest rates go up. So that's a prerequisite. Finally, I want to deal with their claim then on more tailored policies. 1, I will point out empirically that the worst types of policies they talk about have actually decreased in the long run. In the past decade, the types of policies like trade liberalization have gone down by 80%. There's 3 reasons. 1, the anti-globalist movement increased. 2, in the 2000s, Stiglitz, who became the CEO of the World Bank, largely led reform that actively made it so that these policies decrease. And empirically, we see now that even the most staunch neoliberals, like Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, are actively for these types of reforms that we talk about on our side of the house. 2, the US and the World Bank largely face competition on our side to make sure that their policies are effective. 1, because in the event that their policies are ineffective, the capacity for them to gain stability and gain things like that are outcompeted by banks like, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative in China. But 2, on our side of the house, the US faces the types of backlash they wanted to talk about, which is the reason for why the World Bank largely gives out good things. But note, their comparative is woefully underanalyzed, because I don't think the comparative in this world is all of the developing countries working together. Firstly, because developing countries are illiberal, and oftentimes the capacity for you to actively work together is muted by the fact that you also have brutal dictators that necessarily don't want to work together on their side of the house. In fact, it is conditions by the World Bank, humanitarian conditions, that actively make it so you see positive reform in these countries. So we flip that argument on their head. But 2, you have bloc voting on their side of the house, which leads to much more blanket policies, right? The only policies that pass on their side are the ones that everybody eventually agrees to vote upon. But that is worse, because that means that the types of efficiency and the emergency crises and all the things they wanted to talk about no longer happen on their side. So we flip their argument as well. Finally, why is it that when large actors turn to their own lending instruments, like the AIIB in China or the USA doing unilateral goals, that is worse? First, this erodes all mechanisms of accountability, and they can have all the bad policy that the proposition doesn't like. On our side, they balance each other out when they have to compete in the World Bank, when there's positive competition that allows you to get votes. Second, each lender is smaller in scale, holds less reserves, and has far smaller capital lenders. This is bad at 1, because the emergency funds that are really important during COVID, for example, no longer exist. But 2, interest rates go up when you have less reserves, when you have less security. That's bad on their side. But finally, you can't pool resources, which are also often necessary. 1, to have power sharing and having global agreements on, for example, climate change. Those are the types of things you can't get on their side as well.
Speaking slow for 8 minutes and 20 seconds. Judges, may we proceed with the next speaker? Okay. So, may I invite the web speaker from the proposition to the first speaker?
If I talk at this volume, is it okay? Okay. Western aid claims to be the firefighters, but in fact, they are the arsonists. Unnuanced policies in Bolivia led millions to being displaced, and market liberalization in Sierra Leone led to them being hyperinflated, which damaged their economy hugely. No more does Team Japan stand for this injustice and let this continue. We're proud to oppose. With that, I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 broad areas of clashes. Firstly, I'm going to talk about quality of politics. Secondly, I'm going to talk about their main argument on principle. Thirdly, on donation capacity for the World Bank. And then finally, the argument they never touched upon, which is collaboration between developed nations. Firstly then, on the most important topic about quality of policies. And here's 2-way metrics as to why this argument was the most important topic in the debate. Firstly, because their practical argument about donation doesn't mean anything if those donations aren't being used to effective use. But secondly, the end impact of their donation argument is only important insofar as these donations actually lead to net benefit on the ground and these policies lead to net benefit. Therefore, what I need to prove to you in this argument in order for us to win this debate is to prove in instances where Western policies end up being ineffective is the more probable context in this debate. And we told you this for a couple of reasons. But notably, we told you that Western nations instigated policies do not consider localized context and therefore are ineffective. They never directly engaged this analysis, right? Because that was the premise for our analysis. But basically, their engagement was a non-response because they skewed the conversation away to talk about things like Chinese BRI and things like corporate investment, holding them accountable. Two responses to each of these examples. First, Chinese BRI is literally not a thing anymore because China's economy is failing. That's why you see loads of Chinese BRI being taken away at the moment, and Xi Jinping increasingly becoming less expansionist in the status quo. The second, corporate funding only exists for nations that are especially profitable for these corporations. These developing nations that need these aid the most aren't likely to produce that much aid. If they did, then they would likely have done so already. Sure.
No, the point is 93.4% of the annual income that the World Bank makes comes from private capital lenders that on your side no longer lend or lend at much higher interest rates, which is obviously worse for these developing countries.
I don't get it. Because on one hand, they argue that the World Bank is comprised of the US and Western nations, and on the other hand, they say 90% are from private investors. I just don't get their argument. With that, we told, as the implication of all of this is that we proved to you that Western nations' instigated policies are unlikely to consider localized context, and to this, they offer no response. But why was this so detrimental to all of their cases? This is because the nations that need the most help in the status quo, who are entrenched in poverty, despite the years of them trying to get out from it, are likely to have layered reasons as to why they're in economic destitution. Therefore, the implication of this whole entire thing is that the nations that need the aid the most are likely to be most heavily damaged because of UN's policies by the West. They finally talk about bloc economies and bloc voting systems, but that's unlikely to happen because developing nations have united incentives as well. Moreover, there's things like arbitrators in place. There's also systems in place like supermajority voting that ensures that deadlocks do not happen. Therefore, I just don't see the extent of their 15-second argument. We have to engage that more in their way. With that, let's talk about the principle, which is their presumable biggest point in this debate. Okay, I have two responses. Firstly, they assert that it should be based, principles should be based upon population of people that contribute to the economic foundation of the World Bank. But actually, we think that it should be weighed upon the population and the number of people affected by the World Bank policies. And thus, we prove that developing nations are the ones that need to be principally prioritized in this debate when we're talking about the World Bank, because their policies are all about developing nations. But secondly, I think the more smart argument from their side of the house is that the amount of power should be in proportion to their economic scale. Two responses to this. First of all, this is just wrong, right? The ones with the most power should be the ones that are balanced power in economic institutions, because if they don't, this allows for things like abuse to happen within those big nations. Therefore, we think that poor nations are disproportionately imbalanced by this policy, and therefore we think that they deserve a principal reciprocal obligation for them to be given this kind of principled moral mandate. With that, secondly, we actually flip their argument that power should be in disproportion to the amount of economic skill that these countries have. This is because the amount of economic skill is proportional to the capacity for you to fight those abuses. Now let me compare on why our principle in the split is more likely to stand in their principle, which they never actually do, and their next speaker has to do so. This is because weighing principles is objectively hard. So the only way in which you can actually weigh principles is if you look at the subjective way in which people on the ground and societies embrace principles. So therefore, the implication of this is that a principle is, and the importance of it is only contingent on societies buying into these stuff. And it's pretty intuitive that the society buys into our argument far better than their side of the house. This is because you see multiple examples of rich people being taxed heavier than poor people, which violates their principle hugely and supports their principle and such. Therefore, we just think, intuitively speaking, we win on the principle ground as well. Let's then finally talk about donations and capacity for the World Bank. Basically, I have two responses that breaks their premise. First of all, their premise is basically that this donation is somehow economically damaging to big nations like the US, so they would somehow pull out. This is just factually not true, as we already told you from OJ's speech. They say to respond that $3.1 billion are used annually as donations, but the thing is, the US is literally a $1 trillion economy. It's extremely unlikely that this heavily influences the calculus of the government on the whole. Secondly, this argument rests on the assumption that the West cares about utilitarian return. This proves a misunderstanding that's fundamental in Team Canada's case. The World Bank doesn't pay back the West. The World Bank never gets the West utilitarian return. Therefore, what is the actual incentive of the World Bank and donations that's going into the World Bank? These are things that's contingent upon perception. West cares about perception. And we told you that things like international backlash are the reason why. And to the response, Op2 tries to argue that they care about domestic backlash, and they try to weigh it. But the reason why international backlash is likely to matter more in this debate is because literally things like America, Western economies, are often heavily influenced by the capacity for them to do trade and stuff. And therefore, because their whole economy is literally contingent upon things like trade, it's really crucial for them to have good international relations with as many countries as possible. Therefore, that's the reason why, even if they care about domestic outcomes, they likely care prior to that, the international outcomes at hand. Then finally, so therefore, all of the implication of this is that yes, maybe even in an absolute worst case, where we can see that some amount of money will be pulled out of the World Bank, if the full entirety of the fund is pulled out of the World Bank in order for the World Bank to be collapsing, we think that that will hold the US severely accountable in terms of perception, and therefore the impact of the argument is not as severe as they claim it to be. With that, they also say investors investing outside of the World Bank, but number one, they never clarify where they'll actually invest. The kinds of nations that need the most investment by the World Bank is countries that are not profitable in terms of investment. But secondly, investing more, if that's actually the case, if they say that developmental aid will happen through other forms, we think that that's actually a good thing that supports our side of the house. Because on our side, then they agree that there's going to be a coexistence of multiple different funds, which holds each other accountable, thus increasing the efficacy of these funds on our side of the house. Let's finally talk about collaboration argument that was also all the way from Britain and never gets an engagement to. This is crucially important because most geographic conflicts in the status quo within developing nations stem from factors such as you wanting resources over other nations. Therefore, the World Bank is a crucial process that stops this, because what the World Bank does is it provides them with so much resources that they don't need to fight against these other nations on the ground to get that resources. Therefore, in terms of conflicts, our second point that they never engaged to was crucially important because it hurts millions of people on the ground. We think that things like conflicts actually damage these developing economies even more and put them in more just substitution. Therefore, for all of those reasons, we have taken over Canada and all of their grounds and incredibly proud to stand on Team Japan.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 59 seconds. May I invite the next speaker onto to deliver a speech from opposition, please.
Good. I just want to start this speech by highlighting how much good in reality the World Bank does for the world. Proposition points to a few examples where the World Bank may have been flawed, where negligence that could have been held accountable may have led to bad outcomes, where incompetence may have occurred, but that was later resolved. But I think this ignores all of our analysis from our side about why in the vast majority of cases, the World Bank is good and does good things. We give you the examples, for example, of Turkey, where $512 million invested was used to expand access to flooding-proof infrastructure. 1.2 Bangladeshi people who now have access to not to be poisoned by toxic sewage thanks from waste management projects from the World Bank. In the vast majority of cases, even ignoring all the incentives of side proposition, many things are simply good for both the West and developing countries, stabilizing economies, recovering from natural disasters. And in these cases under our side, we get the economic benefits and the upliftment of people, while their side has a loss of capital. I'm going to chat about 3 things in this speech. But before that, I just want to start by pointing out their regional cooperation argument is completely bizarre and does not make a lot of sense in this debate. Look at their illustrations from second. They say, Russia will not invade Ukraine because it will lose World Bank votes. Really? So the reason why invasions don't happen is not the thousands of refugees that will flee into your country and may lead to economic devastation, the fact that sanctions mean that your economy is literally inviolable, but instead it is some nebulous idea of World Bank votes that under their side they think is going to lead to conflict. I think this is by far one of the most limited forms of conflict deterrence under their world. And in fact, we can give you many other plausible reasons why conflict happened that are not related to this. Firstly, when Tanush tells you about how these are often illiberal democracies that don't necessarily make decisions on the basis of these votes. But 2, how there are often overwhelming and overriding incentives for conflict that may exist under either side, and in cases where there are not, they are checked by other forces like the economic interconnectedness of societies that is independent of the World Bank. So the regional cooperation argument doesn't make sense, and they spend very little time on it, which I think is indicative of the fact that they think that too. 3 questions. 1, will the policies be good? 2, independent of whether the policies are good, where do you get the hollowing out of World Bank reserves? And 3, on the principle. 1, will the policies be good? I want to start this theme by bringing back 2 bits of framing from our side. They get no response from their side. The first is our frame about how we are not defending the status quo, but a reformed version of the World Bank. And we suggested many reasons for why the World Bank is moving towards reform. We told you the example, for example, in 2010, when the World Bank reformed voting power sharing to give developing countries a greater vote. And even Janet Yellen, the most neoliberal shill of neoliberal shills, supports more voting to the World Bank for developing countries. I think these reasons suggest that in fact there is a movement towards reform in the status quo, and therefore small countries in fact do have more power to challenge many of the neoliberal influences under their side. But the second thing I want to bring back is the importance of the veto, which I really don't think they respond to under their side. What we told you is this: in the status quo, and this is important, large powers have enough of the vote to give them a veto, but they do not have total control over the World Bank. The veto is important because it lets countries block policies that would be very bad for it. So for example, the World Bank reinstating funding for projects in Russia after it was withdrawn due to the war. But as long as powerful countries like the US, like China, and their blocs have the veto, there are incentives to concede on small things, to horse trade away, for example, policies. Because in order to push through policies on your own, you cannot do that with 15%, but you do need a larger percentage of the vote. This suggests that, number one, small countries in fact do have influence in the World Bank, and number two, it responds to their claim about how you cannot hold the West accountable, because in fact you do have leverage to hold the West accountable in these ways. This cuts across every argument that proposition makes, because it suggests that small countries do in fact have power within the World Bank. Their individual claims are as follows. The first thing they say is the World Bank makes blanket policies that are bad. Firstly, I think this is also true under their side. If their argument is, well, politicians want to get things through really fast, that is true independent of it if it is a Western politician or a politician from the developing world. But two, our arguments about how block voting often leads to inefficiency supersedes this to the extent that under their side they're more likely to get those blanket policies that often disagree with one another and cannot be executed effectively. The second thing they say is on ideological imposition of neoliberalism. Firstly, many of the largest powers are becoming emerging economies, like China, like Brazil, like India, so there is in fact a check on Western tyranny. Two, we told you that these things were getting better, that 80%, or the number of structural conditions applicable in World Bank programs, has gone down by more than 80%. That is a reason for why there's less prescriptive development policy under our side. But thirdly, the alternative under their side is simply worse. If countries pull their money out of the World Bank and go elsewhere, then they will do worse policies without any check. They will have 100% of the vote, not just 15%. So all of the forces that they talk about get worse under their side. The implication at the end of this theme is I think many of their claims in this round are marginal. The inequality thing is not that important in this phase. What is more important is theme 2, on the hollowing out of World Bank reserves. What we told you is that this leads countries to claw back their contributions, and that is bad. The response from their side is international backlash. But we pointed out it is not in fact optically bad to withdraw, especially since domestic constituents in opposition powers will be mad about the huge decrease in voting power. We gave the example of Trump withdrawing the US from UNESCO in the UNHRC in 2017 and 2018, and they're not in fact being very much backlash on these types of issues. The response from their side is, while donations are not very damaging for domestic economies, and therefore people will not be mad about it. But that wasn't our point. Our point was that it was perceived as damaging. That people in America would be mad, in fact, if the US lost 15% and went from 15% of the vote and went instead to 1 on 2, 100 or 200 votes as well. The last thing they say is, well, the West does not actually care about utility, they care about perception. Firstly, this is tense with their argumentation about how the West cares about ideological imposition. Because if it is true that they care about utility, about perception only, then clearly they wouldn't do those ideological imposition things under our side of the house either. But two, I simply think it is not true. In fact, you do want to make some sort of investment on your returns. And under their side of the house, the West is less likely to be able to put money into the projects that they want. They're less likely to be able to have, for example, a veto power on projects they don't want, and that is the reason why money disappears under their will. The last thing they say, and the last thing they don't respond to, I think, was our more important argument about why private capital would flee from the World Bank. Under their side, the World Bank loses credibility among capital issuing institutions. Its reserves are smaller, there are more risks around how reserves are managed, the reserves are not underwritten by the guarantees of powerful nations. The response from their side is, well, the private institutions have nowhere else to invest. I think this is vastly implausible. There are so many other places to invest. They can invest, for example, within the stock market. They invest within bonds, in the government. The point is that if the World Bank no longer becomes a secure and safe asset, because many strong and powerful countries have pulled out, Then private capital disappears. Under their side, this is terrible. It is 1 million households in Ethiopia whose lights are snuffed out by the empty coffers of Proposition Bank. I don't think that is something we can accept under our side. Lastly, on the just distribution of power. We told you a really simple thing. I still don't understand why they didn't respond to this charitably. We said if you take the risk, then you should be able to have some control over how the money is being spent. Donations are not morally obligatory, they are optional and they're morally praiseworthy, which is the reason for why you should have control. The responses from their side are just weird. So the first thing they say is, well, you have fiduciary obligations. The fiduciary obligations apply to the people who are giving the money, not to those who are receiving the money. Then they say, well, principles can be violated because of practical benefits, and they're contingent on whether people believe in them. This is not true. If everyone in a democracy wanted to vote to take away the rights of minorities, that wouldn't make it unjust. That wouldn't make it just simply because people believe it. We have an independent moral obligation in this debate to preserve a just distribution of power, and it is only under our side that we secure all of these things. Very proud to stand in opposition.
For 8 minutes and 17 seconds. May we now have the vice speaker from opposition to close their Thank you.
When Proposition said we didn't respond, I think what they really meant was that they didn't listen. When Third Proposition asserted that we didn't respond to the quality of policy that would not be specific to countries, we explained why harsh conditionality was already decreased by 80% in the recent decade, why US policymakers right now currently do support genuine assistance to individuals. We present a counter model straight from the first opposition for the exact representation that we care about. We explain that national policymaking was the most likely approach simply because it is the most effective and cost the World Bank the least amount of money. We get no genuine explanation as to why this wasn't acknowledged. Proposition asserted we didn't realize the importance of trade, the importance of international benefit to countries like the US. But I think we did. America did not need to care, as we pointed out clearly in second, about the status of its exports, given how huge it was as a global hegemon in terms of trade. But it did care about citizens that could vote out the politicians that wanted to remain in power, the citizens who believed that their money was going to a rogue institution that they had very little power over. That was clearly going to be the case. And the point, I think, is this. The incoherency of the Proposition case underlines their inability to respond to the truth of our argumentation, that the World Bank saves lives, that it provides energy to individuals, that it takes people out of starvation, and that would always be good. So I want to talk about two things in this debate to clarify what this debate was about for Canada. Firstly, let's discuss the normative portion of this debate. I just want to point out how we clearly preempt the majority of the responses that we get from Proposition. Proposition told us in second and third that we should care about the impact that exists upon the lives of citizens. But wait, straight from first opposition, we told you that that's not how the democratic system or consent even works. That a Mexican citizen, even though they are probably greatly impacted by American policy, does not necessarily get a vote within the American election. It is the American taxpayers, the people that give to the government, that are the ones that ought to be able to have autonomy over what is going to happen to the things that happen to them. They tell us that abuse is what is important, but that is entirely practically contingent. It is very unclear why we should care about the potentiality of abuse within a system, not simply the fairness and justice of that system as it exists. I think our principle was very, very simple. Siphoning money away from British taxpayers in the millions without autonomy is necessarily unjust. Giving Indonesia one vote, even though they have hundreds of millions of people, simply because of the way it was cut up by France and Indochina, is bad. This is completely wrong and not just to the consent and the governance that countries ought to have. On the World Bank, we pointed out Western influence and bad policymaking was curbed more on our side, that we had existing reform that would always probably be better. They lied and said China is somehow not expansionist within the status quo, where they are literally militarizing in the majority of places and being quite economically encroaching upon the sovereignty of others. But even furthermore, in second, we told you if the West had these incentives, they get even worse. They could set up unilateral agreements with these countries countries that can just entirely bully them. They could sanction them if they really wanted the outcomes that they wanted for their corporate influences. In all cases, we need the World Bank to act as a moderating force. We explained why we lost money. And the analysis that we get straight from first proposition is the reason why. They told us countries are self-serving and care about their own democratic interests. That is the reason why they're not going to put so much billions of dollars into an institution where they have very little financial risk and they don't know what the returns are going to be. Just because they give to the World Bank for development does not mean that they suddenly do not care about the large amounts of money that is going to be within the institution that could be used for other places within their own nationalities. We told you that international institutions like Goldman Sachs didn't care at all about optics. They didn't care about international relations. They cared about cold hard cash and whether or not the development that happened would actually give positive returns in terms of infrastructure, in terms of relief, in terms of build toward a weird policy. It is money, and that assistance is the problem that we should care about. Incredibly proud to report.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. May we now have the top speaker from top position to close their case and the debate conference.
Firstly, let's delete their claim on principle. Their claim was really simple. They say that the money that you have to, and like the representation or things like that should be proportionate towards the money that you should donate. The first thing I want to point out is, we've been telling you out throughout the bench that principle can be way lower than the practical benefit. This is because in the instances you are actively damaging people on the ground, that is at the point in which your rights should be way lower. The analogy here is simple. Things like drugs or things like alcohol, in those instances, your rights can be taken over. Their analogy here is that, it's like a donation, it's like minorities. But those kind of instances do not stand because you're not actively harming people on the ground. That is why I think it's automatically transitions to the question of whether or not, which says utilitarianly better, this is a non-argument, this is a contingent argument. Secondly, I want to note that we already proved to you this counter-principle argument from our economy that came in our whip. That is, that this power should be disproportionate towards these things like that. And I think we already mechanistically proved to you why principle is more likely to stay on our side of the house. They needed to engage to that. But lastly, I just want you to know that they never gave any principle weighing as to why this outweighs our practical utilitarian argument. I think it's just that the case that everything is speculative on the level of principle, right? That is why I think utilitarian benefit with that, they spend more money, time as well, which is more likely to be important class to win this debate. Given that, 3 classes. Firstly, on the conflict. Secondly, on the equality, which is the most important argument in this debate. And finally, let's talk about donation. Firstly then, what did we tell you from our PPM? We told you as to why those kind of conflicts are likely to be eased insofar as they have selfish incentives to want to actually acquire things like donation and aid from the World Bank. Their response that came from WIP was simple. They say that there's an overriding incentive to want to have a conflict on either side of the house. But I just want you to note that that is literally what we're saying, right? They have a selfish incentive to want to actually go to conflicts, right? But if that was true, our argument stands, because our argument is literally about getting donation and getting aid, right? That is why, in order to actually get aid in the future, you're less likely to have conflict uniquely on Team Japan. That is why we flipped their argument. Notice that this is an independent path to victory, because they literally gave you 20 seconds response, and we already weighed you on OG's speech saying that this harms people on the ground. Let's talk about quality, which is presumably the most important argument in this debate. Our weighing mechanism here was simple. Each policy is literally affecting people on the ground, and those individuals are simply getting harmed. And therefore, even if you have money, if you're doing something that is really bad, that is, I think, not standing within this debate. Given that, why does this point literally on team competition and why are we winning this? The first one I point out is, I think on an incentive level, we told you from the first that Western agenda is simply more important for those Western nations as opposed to developing nations. And I think they proved this for us, right? Like throughout their speeches, they've been telling you that domestic backlash or things like that is more likely to be actually like, important for them. But what we're saying is that things like trade liberalization happens because they are likely to simply prioritize their benefits over the benefits of developing nations. That is why we flip their analysis and tell you that these kind of like policies are actually deprived of their incentive to care more about their population. But secondly, we already gave a lot of analysis in things like contextualized knowledge, which I think was not responded to by your second or third speaker. Given that, I think that their argument on things like Chinese BRI is incredibly speculative because we already told you as to why these kind of things are drastically decreasing when you look at things like statistics. And moreover, even if this was the case, I don't think they literally take down our three of the mechanisms. Given that, finally, let's just talk about donation decreasing, right? Firstly, this is important. If their argument on domestic backlash being really, really big is really true, why are they really donating in the first place? It is likely that I think like a lot of the, like for example, when you consider things in Japan, Kishida Fumio Prime Minister literally gets a lot of backlash from literally giving out so many money in the ground. But the thing is, they still continue doing that because they want soft power, and that is presumably symmetric on either side of the house. But secondly, I just want you to note that these things are the things, though even if like, I think like things like perceptions are symmetric, but even if we lose on that, we've been telling you hold down the bench on a consistent level that quality is what matters. That is why we automatically take this.